advantage. So fewer doctrines.
Yeah, quickly, yeah.
Quick addition to that. Whether or not it's a doctrine, I think that it would be helpful for some statement to come out from the president-elect which shows cognizance of the historical importance of American leadership, its characteristics, its purposes, and its limitations. That would be very helpful, for example, thinking about the APEC meeting in Lima, where this is going to be Xi Jinping's stage, because currently there's a vacuum. We don't know if there is even interest in continued leadership going forward, so it needn't be a doctrine. But a strong signal would be helpful even in the short term, even if the characteristics
Well,
of a
let me
Trump
test
policy
you on
may
that, though. I mean, isn't it going to depend a lot on who he appoints? I mean, we just have this from the overflow room, Marino de Alba of Georgetown University, asking how is, foreign affairs going to be conducted? Are we going to see a dominant presidential leadership, dominant Secretary of State? I mean, look, he laid out a lot of policies that were inconsistent, and some people didn't really know that he has a nuanced worldview. Is that going to fall to his Secretary of State?
But even, again, well, I think we've all mentioned that personnel is policy. Whether or not there is a commitment to continued, if evolving, American leadership is a prior question that can come only from the president, and it's still largely unknown. People may think it's assumed, but I haven't heard it stated.
Okay. Questions? Sir in the back, in the blue jacket, yes. Again, please keep your questions short. Identify yourself.
Hello, my name is Nyakala Guke. I'm from the Ivory Coast. And haven't heard anything about Africa. I mean, the continent of Africa or sub-Saharan Africa. So my question is this. We heard the president-elect distance himself, from, the way the French or France is conducting its business in Africa. And there is an opposition to the way French does business. Do you think that it is an opportunity for Africa to negotiate more freedom and more sovereignty? To any of you in the panel. Thank you.
Good question. That there has not really been any discussion of Africa in the campaign, so I think it's really an open question. Who's going to take that one?
I mean, Africa was a major priority for the Bush administration and to a large degree for the Obama administration for many reasons. And I wish I had an answer, a good answer to your question.
I wish we had Monday.
Or exactly. And I think this is one of the areas which I'm not entirely sure that the putative Trump administration has thought through all that clearly.
Can I just say something broadly speaking? So, of course, there's always going to be a list of boxes that a new incoming president has got to check on every foreign policy issue, just as there is on every domestic policy issue. Some of it you do by proxy, by appointing people who then go and give the speech and check the box, sort of, I, President so-and-so, care about the association of X. And so I'll speak at your convention. But the risk is you start going down that road, and pretty soon you end up at the dead ends or the lose-lose choices, right? You've got to choose either China's side or Taiwan's side, right? The Israeli side or the Gulf state side or something. And the problem with that is you only lose political capital doing that. And in the early years, certainly the early months of an administration, it'd be very wise, I think, to agglomerate and accumulate as much political capital as possible so that the things that are important for you to do, you have some chance of getting done before you are then faced with either re-election problems or legacy problems. I mean, this is sort of basic, new presidential administration 101. So what I would hope, just, my 10-second elevator pitch recommendation to the president-elect is avoid as many of those as you can early on, while still conveying a seriousness and an openness and the sort of listening tour stuff that will reassure thoughtful Americans.
Thanks, Matt. Right here in the middle. Yep.
Thank you. I'm Noelle Schroeder of Women Thrive Alliance. We've heard only a brief mention of the United States' role in promoting good governance and democratic institutions and human rights around the world. And so I'd love to hear from the panelists, based on your interpretations of what Trump has espoused during his campaign, what will the United States' role be in promoting especially human rights and in particular gender equality around the world, and how will we prevent any rollback on the gains that have been made in the last 8 years?
Aaron, what do you think?
I can only, again, quote Kaplan's notion, order before freedom and interest before values. It just seems to me, and I think the current administration recognized this in the last several years, that the notion of transforming certain conflict areas was going to be beyond its capacity to achieve. I suspect, given the way statements that the president-elect has made with respect to leaders like Erdogan and Sisi, that the emphasis will not be on pushing issues related to internal reform or human rights, let alone the issue of humanitarian intervention in a place like Syria.
Well, Cindy, let me pick up on that. We have in the overflow room Gustavo from Ecuador asking, would a President Trump assume a different position negotiating with authoritarian regimes in the Latin American region? So what do you do with a Maduro, for instance? And the relationship with Cuba. I mean, look, the Obama administration thought, in its opening to Cuba that would help moderate the regime and, would in fact encourage more human rights, more democracy. What happens to that relationship?
Well, again, it's a little early to tell, but I think we can look at various courses of action and the predicted consequences. The preference, or the apparent preference, for authoritarian regimes, for strong leaders, doesn't really apply in the Venezuelan case. Venezuela is a crisis of major proportions in economic terms, governance terms, and humanitarian terms. There is no, I firmly believe, no unilateral U.S. approach that can help Venezuela make a transition of some kind to a government that will be able to revive the economy and create the basis for a more functioning governance system. So I think that formulaic principles are not very helpful in this case, and there will have to be a reliance or a return and an emphasis on multilateralism and actually on the reaffirmation of democratic values, because you cannot it is not possible to envision a solution in Venezuela that depends merely on the strengthening of the current regime. In terms of Cuba, I think you're right. There was this assumption that greater economic ties, people-to-people contact, family sending remittances would create inevitable pressures for greater openness, freedom of expression, and democracy. The Cuban government, I think, has not shared that set of principles, has strongly resisted the sense that U.S. policy under Obama could lead to regime change. And it's really, I think, questionable how Donald Trump will approach this. I think that there's some reason to believe that he will not want to rescind the executive orders that have allowed for greater economic contact. Otherwise, it's the Swedes and the Canadians and the Germans and all the other countries of the world that are investing and taking advantage of tourism opportunities and other kinds of things.
I think it's really interesting what we've talked about in terms of the transactional nature of this administration, and also on the bottom line, is a little bit inconsistent with overturning some of these executive orders. For instance, Duncan, if you want economic opportunity and investment and such, Cuba, you would think would be a place where this government would look. You would think that, continuing to strengthen the relationship, the trade, with Mexico would work here. And just to add from Facebook, Piolo Navarro from Mexico says, one first easy promise seems to be renegotiation or exit from NAFTA. What do you think about this? How do you see this playing out? And do you think what role would the WTO take instead? A lot there to unpack, but.
Yeah, so first of all, I'd like to address the last question because I think it's a really important one. I mean, which issues are going to be on the ascendant, which ones are going to be falling sort of not off the agenda but becoming less of a priority? And we've put a lot of thought into this over the last week or so. in the bilateral relationship, and thinking that the words security and prosperity are probably going to be the driving elements in the relationship with Mexico. Human rights, climate change are not going to be priorities in that relationship. Now, that means from the point of view of the executive branch, it doesn't mean that they fall off the agenda entirely. I mean, I can see a strong role for elements within Congress and, of course, within civil society in keeping those elements alive. But in terms of the specific question on NAFTA, there's a lot of confusion about what, in fact, the U.S. president can do in terms of pulling the United States out of NAFTA. Remember that this is a free trade agreement. It's not a treaty for the United States. It required both chambers of Congress to approve it. And part of the logic there was to make it more difficult for any future president to change it unilaterally without consulting the Congress. And so we have now a situation where the president will have to engage with his own party in Congress. And almost all of those people in Congress are going to say, look, this is economic suicide to drop out of the NAFTA. There are certain things that you can do around the margins which will be enough to placate your base if that's what you need to do. There are certain ways in which we can, in fact, improve the treaty without opening it up. Because as soon as you open up...
You think that's what he's going to do?
Well, I think that here's the big problem. If you open up the NAFTA for renegotiation, it's not a unilateral negotiation. Mexico and Canada are going to have their own issues in there. And then you have to get the whole thing through Congress again.
Wasn't that the thing? Wasn't that the thing with TPP, right? That he said, well, you had, more than a dozen nations. So I think one thing that we're all talking about right now is that a lot of these are his opening kind of bargaining or negotiating positions, but not necessarily where we're going to end up. I think we have time for one or two more right here.
Owen Phelps, International Energy Partnerships. This question is for Mr. Daly in particular. You hinted upon the Southeast Asian states adopting a more accommodating relationship with China. What about the more stalled allies such as Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan? What would be some potential options that they'd likely pursue in the wake of potential U.S. disengagement?
Okay, great. And in the back, right here, in the middle, we'll take both questions and we'll finish up.
Thank you very much for your remarks. My name is Yurter Özcan. I'm the U.S. representative for CHP, the main opposition party in Turkey. I know you touched upon this, but I want to ask about the role of Kurds in Syria. Trump and Erdogan already have a good personal relationship. Erdogan participated in the opening of Trump International in Istanbul a couple of years ago, and they talked on the phone, and it was supposedly positive. And we know that Trump wants to take a strong stance against ISIS, and he said he wants to destroy them. How is it going to, not cause any friction between Erdogan and Trump vis-a-vis the role of Kurds?
Thank you. We want to take that. We'll take both of those, and then I think we're going to have to.
That's clearly a critical question, because even if the offensive against Mosul in Iraq concludes by Inauguration Day, it's likely, given the complexities that separate any American-backed offensive against Raqqa, the reality is that force, that Syrian Defense Force, is 30,000, 25,000 of them are Kurds. And that, how do you replace and reconstitute that force? You don't. The truth is you don't. That's going to be a decision, I suspect, or an issue that's going to fall on Mr. Trump's plate after January. And balancing success in Raqqa, post-conflict stabilization, and our equities with the Turks and their opposition to Syrian Kurdish pretensions in Syria, nationalist pretensions, that's going to be a very difficult issue to handle.
Thanks, Robert.
Potential responses in Northeast Asia from Japan and South Korea to a potential disengagement from the United States. Again, two potentials. I think you can guess what my response to that is going to be. It's a little bit too hypothetical. Clearly, candidate Trump did say that South Korea and Japan should pay more for their own defense. I do not assume that statement was based on deep, careful consideration of the importance of our alliance.
Or knowledge about what they're actually paying.
No, and what we see now, in fact, is that insofar as we can tell who's being appointed to the Trump administration, they're mostly defense hawks and people who want to increase the size of the American Navy, people who understand our alliances with South Korea and Japan, and in particular people who are extremely supportive of Taiwan. So what we see so far in the appointments or the looming appointments is a shift back in the other direction. And as in Duncan's case with NAFTA, now that he is sitting down and actually asking people what he should be doing in the region, asking people in Congress, asking his own advisors, he's going to be hearing that these alliances are extraordinarily important and that the American military cannot be treated as mercenaries that gets hired out to South Korea and Japan. So this is very much in play.
All right, well, unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there. We went for an hour and a half. We could certainly go for another couple hours. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to my panel, and thank you to Jane and the Wilson Center.